Montana Territory, October 1881. The wind screamed down from the mountains that morning, sharp with frost and the scent of pine, but it was the sound of a baby crying that made Weston Kade pull his horse to a stop. He was 3 miles west of Fort Benton, heading back to his cabin after hauling lumber through the high pass. The trail was quiet, save for the wind and that cry, thin, desperate, and too steady to ignore. Weston dismounted, listening. The sound came from the ravine off the trail, where the underbrush grew thick around a half-collapsed freight crate that must have tumbled off a wagon months ago. He stepped carefully through the scrub, his boots crunching frostbitten leaves, and drew his coat tighter as he approached. The crate was cracked open on one side. Inside, curled in the straw and broken wood, was a girl, no, a young woman clutching a baby wrapped in a threadbare quilt. Her clothes were ragged, her face hollow with hunger and cold, but her eyes were alert, wild with protectiveness. She looked maybe 19. The baby could not have been more than a few months old. "Do not come closer," she said, her voice hoarse. She pulled the baby tighter into her chest. "I have a knife." Weston raised his hands. "I believe you," he said, "but you are shaking too much to use it." "I will still try." He nodded. "I would too if I were you." She stared at him, breathing hard. Weston knelt slowly, setting his gloves on the ground. "I have a cabin," he said. "It's warm. There is food, clean water. You and the baby can come with me." She narrowed her eyes. "Why would you help us?" "Because it is the right thing," he said simply. "Because no one should be living in a crate." She looked down at the baby, her sister, Weston guessed. "I do not know you." "I am Weston Kade," he said. "I build cabins. I haul freight. I live alone. I do not hurt women. And I swear on my mother's grave, you and that baby will be safe with me." She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Her name is Birdie. She is my sister." He nodded. "What is your name?" "Persephone Wren." Weston stood and held out a hand. "Come where the fire's warm, Persephone." She hesitated, then slowly reached out, her fingers icy in his. Her legs buckled as she stood, but Weston caught her before she fell, one arm under her knees, the other around her back. She buried her face in Birdie's hair, and Weston carried them both the half-mile back to his horse. He wrapped them in his spare coat, settled them both on the saddle in front of him, and led them home. The sun was low by the time they reached the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Weston thanked God he had remembered to stoke the fire that morning. He pushed the door open and carried Persephone inside, setting her gently on the cot near the hearth. She did not let go of Birdie. "I will heat broth," Weston said. "You need something in you before you fall apart." Persephone gave a faint nod, her eyes following him warily as he moved around the cabin. He worked quickly, setting a pot to boil, laying out a blanket for Birdie, cutting slices of bread. When he handed her the bowl, she took it with trembling fingers and drank the broth slowly. Birdie was already asleep, curled against her chest. She did not speak again until the bowl was empty. "We were headed to Oregon," she said. "Our parents died of fever in Kansas City. I was trying to get us to my uncle, but the wagon master left us behind when I could not pay the rest." Weston sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "I was 16 when I buried my father," he said. "He died in the blizzard of '74. My mother was already gone. There was no one left to look after me, so I learned how to look after myself. I reckon you are doing the same." She looked down at Birdie, brushing a hand over her dark curls. "I tried," she whispered. "You did more than most would." He leaned forward. "And now you do not have to do it alone." She looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time without fear. There was something else there now, worn-down hope. "I do not know how to be anything but scared anymore," she admitted. "You do not have to be anything tonight," Weston said gently. "Just rest." He gave her his bedroll and took the floor by the fire. Birdie stirred once in her sleep, but did not cry. Persephone lay beside her, eyes open in the firelight, watching Weston like she was trying to memorize the way safety looked. By morning, the wind had quieted. Birdie laughed for the first time as Weston fed her mashed potato from a spoon, and Persephone watched him with something like wonder. She stayed. One day turned into two, then a week. Weston fixed up the lean-to and built a second cot. Persephone helped with chores when she had the strength, and Weston taught her how to chop wood and boil beans without burning the bottom of the pot. She started to laugh, soft and quick, like she was surprised by the sound of it. He noticed the way she hummed when she rocked Birdie, the way she brushed her fingers over Weston's arm when she passed him a cup of coffee. She no longer flinched when he came near. One night, as they sat by the fire with Birdie asleep between them, Weston asked, "What do you want, Persephone?" She was quiet for a long time before answering. "I want to stop being afraid. I want Birdie to grow up with more than just hunger and cold. I want a home." "You have one now," he said quietly. Her eyes met his, and something shifted in the air between them. Her hand reached out, fingers brushing over his. He turned his palm, their hands fitting together like they had always been meant to. "I never thought I would find someone kind out here," she whispered. "I never thought I would find someone like you," Weston said. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. Birdie stirred in her sleep, then settled again, and the fire burned warm, long into the night. By mid-November, snow clung to the pine boughs like the land had drawn a deep, silent breath. Weston's cabin sat tucked beneath a ridge where the wind slowed some, but the cold still seeped through the wood. Persephone had taken to wrapping Birdie in layers of muslin and wool Weston traded for in town, tucking her close under a sling she'd sewn from an old curtain. The child's cheeks pinked with health now, her belly full, her cries fewer. Weston was out back splitting spruce with slow, steady strokes when Persephone stepped into the yard, her boots crunching over the frozen ground. She held a small tin in her hand and crossed to him, her breath visible each time she spoke. "I boiled tallow with spruce resin," she said. "For your hands." He paused, resting the axe against a stump. She reached for his palm, turning it gently. The skin was cracked across the knuckles, flecked with blood where the cold had bitten deep. "Didn't figure you'd notice," he said. "I notice when people hurt." She dipped her fingers in the salve and rubbed it into his skin. He didn't flinch, but he couldn't quite meet her eyes either. "You could have gone to Fort Benton and left us," she said. "Told someone else to take us in. Why didn't you?" He shifted his weight, voice low. "I didn't want you with someone who'd look at you like a burden." She nodded slowly, then offered him the tin. "Keep it nearby. I've got more resin simmering." He took it without a word, but the way his fingers curled around hers lingered longer than needed. Later that day, Weston brought home a second-hand cradle he'd traded a pair of iron hinges and a smoked ham for. He didn't mention it, just set it near the hearth, lined it with clean flannel, and went back to stripping bark from fence posts. Persephone touched the smooth rail once, then looked over at him. "You're not used to being noticed either, are you?" He didn't answer, but she saw the way his shoulders eased. That night, snow fell in a hush. Persephone sat by the fire with her mending while Weston cleaned his rifle at the table. Birdie stirred in the cradle, then settled again. The silence between them wasn't heavy, it folded soft around them, like worn cotton. "Before this," she said suddenly, threading her needle, "I worked in a sewing room in Kansas City. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. I used to dream of walking outside, without someone shouting at me to hurry." Weston looked over. "Do you miss the city?" "I miss the parts where I wasn't scared, but I don't miss the noise, or the stink of coal soot." He nodded. "I worked in a mine once. Copper shaft down in Butte. Couldn't breathe right for a month after." "You ever think of leaving Montana?" He shook his head. "This land's hard, but it's honest. I'd rather freeze here than sweat under someone else's thumb." She set her sewing aside and stood, crossing to the table. Her fingers grazed the rifle's barrel where he'd just finished oiling it. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked. "What?" "Trusting someone." His hand covered hers. "It gets possible." Persephone didn't pull away. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "I feel safer here than I ever have, but I keep waiting for that to change." "It won't," he said, steady and sure. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, really looked, and something in her settled. When she leaned in, it wasn't fast or fiery. Her lips brushed his cheek, soft as breath. Then she turned away to check on Birdie, who now slept with one hand curled around the edge of the cradle like she too had claimed something. Weston stayed at the table a long while after. When he finally banked the fire and lay down, it was with a quiet that felt earned, not empty. Morning came with a high sun and a sky the color of bleached bone. Persephone was already outside, her shawl wrapped tight, examining the shed Weston had started building beside the cabin. He joined her, brushing frost from the doorframe. "You're planning something," she said. "Storage for food. Tools. Maybe a place to keep the cradle once Birdie's grown." She glanced at him, brow raised. That's years off. Some things are worth building toward. She smiled, not quick or uncertain this time. The kind that came from someplace deeper. He handed her the hammer. Your turn. She took it without hesitation. By early December, the river had hardened under a skin of ice, and the trees stood stripped and silent. The days shortened, pressing their lives into the soft, flickering hours between morning frost and dusk. Weston taught Persephone how to track rabbits by the zigzag of their prints, and she showed him how to stretch a patch of cloth with uneven thread by turning the weft just so. They never spoke of what would come after winter, only what could be done with the day in front of them. That morning, Weston returned from the ridge with a brace of grouse, his coat stiff with snow. He stomped the cold from his boots on the porch, then stepped inside to the smell of juniper and simmering onions. Persephone stood at the hearth, sleeves rolled, stirring a pot with one hand, while steadying Birdie on her hip with the other. You took your time, she said, not looking away from the pot. Found tracks near the alder grove. Something heavy. He set down the birds and unwrapped the scarf from his neck. Might be elk moving early. They'll break through the river ice if they head too low. He watched her test the broth with a fingertip, then lift the spoon to Birdie's mouth. The child tasted it and gave a small, satisfied sigh. He felt his chest tug in a way he hadn't expected. You ever think of teaching? He asked. Persephone gave him a curious glance. Teaching, reading, stitchwork. You've got a head for how things fit. There's going to be a schoolhouse in spring. Might be needing someone with patience. No one's ever asked what I might be good at, she said quietly. I was always just meant to keep quiet and keep up. Well, you don't have to do that here. She looked at him then, fully. I wouldn't know where to start. Weston shrugged. Starting's just doing the first thing. Rest follows. She gave Birdie a kiss on the crown and shifted her to her other hip. And what about you? What do you want, besides full firewood and quiet mornings? He hesitated. He hadn't been asked that in years. I want to build something that outlasts me. Not just timber and nails. A life. Something solid. Persephone stepped closer, her skirt brushing his leg. You think we could do that? I think we already are. Later, as dusk pressed in, Persephone bundled Birdie into her shawl and stood beside Weston on the porch. The snow had stopped, and the sky stretched out clear and wide, lit by the pale hush of stars. The trees didn't move, not even a whisper of wind. There's a steadiness to this, she said. To what? This, she said again, a little softer. The way the days fold into each other. No one chasing us, no one looking to take. Nothing's owed here, he said. Just earned. She reached for his hand, fitting her fingers between his. Then let's keep earning it. He turned toward her, brushing his thumb along the edge of her knuckles. You sure? I wouldn't say it if I wasn't. Weston's mouth found hers just as the lantern light flickered behind them. It wasn't rushed, but it held the weight of every quiet hour they'd shared. When they parted, her forehead rested against his collarbone, and his arms drew her in without needing to ask. Inside, Birdie slept in the cradle, one hand tucked beneath her cheek. Persephone pressed close, her voice a murmur. We're not just surviving anymore, are we? He shook his head. We're building. And we're not finished yet. She nodded once, then leaned her head against his chest as the stars hung steady above them, like they had always been meant to witness this. On the third morning of December's thaw, the stream behind the shed began to trickle again, faint but steady. Persephone crouched near its edge, watching water slip past the stones like it had remembered how. Birdie sat in the sling across her back, dozing, her breath warm against Persephone's neck. Weston was off in the draw, checking the trap lines he'd set before the last freeze, but she wasn't anxious. Not anymore. She ran her hand through the brittle grass, noting how the ground was softening beneath. It stirred something in her, not quite joy, but something close. She stood, adjusted Birdie's weight, and turned back toward the cabin. Inside, she scraped ash from the stove and added wood from the new stack Weston had split near the shed. The warmth built slowly, and she laid out a clean cloth on the table, unfolding the small stack of letters she'd never mailed. They were to her uncle in Oregon, half promises, half pleas, written back when she still believed someone might come for them. She tore them in half, then again, and fed the pieces into the stove one by one. When the door opened behind her, she didn't turn. She knew the rhythm of Weston's boots now, how he stepped softer when he was tired. "You catch anything?" she asked, still watching the paper curl and blacken. "2 hares and a fox," he said. One snare was snapped clean through. Something bigger came through the ridge. She turned then and saw the way his coat was soaked at the shoulders. He shrugged it off, hung it by the fire, then stepped close enough to see the ashes. "You change your mind about Oregon?" "I don't need to look west anymore," she said. He didn't answer, but something in his face eased. That night, she brought out a tin she'd hidden beneath the cot weeks ago. Inside were the last of the dried currants she'd carried from Kansas City, a crumbled twist of paper tied with string. "I was saving these," she said, setting them on the table. "Didn't know what for." Weston sat across from her, Birdie curled in his lap. "You do now?" She nodded. For the first day, that didn't feel borrowed. She boiled the currants down with flour and snow sugar, folded them into the cornmeal batter, and baked 2 small cakes in the cast-iron pan. They ate in silence, Birdie licking the sticky crumbs from her fingers, Weston's thumb brushing her cheek clean without a word. When the plates were cleared, Weston leaned back and looked at Persephone with something unreadable in his gaze. "You ever think about marrying again?" he asked. She met his eyes. "I never did the first time." He paused. "You were promised?" "No. Just taken." Weston's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. She reached across the table, laying her hand over his. "I don't carry that with me anymore. Not like I did." His voice was low. "You shouldn't have ever had to." "I know," she said, "but I'm still here. And so are you." He turned his hand to hold hers. "Would you want to be joined?" "Not by a preacher. Not yet. Just by understanding." "Yes," she said, without hesitation. Weston stood and crossed to her. He helped her up, and they stood in the center of the room, the fire behind them, the cradle to their side. He didn't kiss her, not yet. He just held her hand, palm to palm, and said, "Then this is our vow, that I'll stand beside you, that I'll raise her with you, that this home stays yours as long as breath stays in me." She nodded, her voice steady. "And I'll keep standing beside you, in quiet, in work, in whatever comes." Birdie reached out from the cradle, and Persephone bent to lift her. Weston wrapped his arm around both of them, and they stood there, the 3 of them, in the stillness. Outside, the snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing the earth beneath, dark and waiting. When they lay down that night, Persephone curled into the crook of Weston's shoulder. Her hand rested against his chest, and she could feel the beat of him slow, strong, and sure. "You sleep light," she murmured. "Not anymore," he said. And he didn't. Come March, the thaw came in earnest. The ground steamed in the mornings, and the sap ran wet in the birch trees. Persephone stood barefoot in the mud, sleeves rolled, coaxing green shoots from the earth beside the cabin. Weston had carved neat rows beside her, and Birdie sat in a shallow basket nearby, chewing the corner of a cloth doll made from a scrap of Weston's old shirt. Persephone pressed her palm to the soil. "It's warmer than I thought it'd be." Weston leaned on the spade. "South side of the ridge gets the earliest sun. That's why I built here. You think we'll get carrots in before the frost turns again? If the weather holds. I've got seed onion and beans put up too. Could trade for potatoes if we need." She glanced up at him. "You always plan this far out." "I didn't used to. But I've got reason now." She smiled, then turned back to the row. "I want to build a coop. Chickens, maybe a milk goat if I can learn the keeping. I'm tired of trading for eggs. We'll cut timber for it next week. You draw what you want, it'll be yours." Birdie let out a sharp squeal and threw her doll into the mud. Persephone wiped her hands and lifted her from the basket, brushing curls from her brow. "She's cutting another tooth," she said. "Can't be more in a day out." Weston took the child from her arms, bouncing her gently. "You should rest your hands. I'll finish the bed." She hesitated. "I can still work." "I know you can. But you don't have to right now." That gave her pause. She watched him crouch to settle Birdie back in the basket, tucking the doll beside her like it was instinct. Then he went back to digging, and she sat on the cabin step, elbows on her knees, listening to the sound of the spade folding soil and the birds chattering in the trees overhead. By week's end, the coop frame stood behind the shed, cedar planked and squared true. Persephone had painted a rooster on the door with a bit of lampblack and beeswax, laughing to herself as she did. Weston had watched from the porch, arms crossed, the corner of his mouth twitching as she stepped back and admired her work. "I know it's crooked," she said. "It's better that way. Looks like it belongs." That night, as the wind picked up and the sky turned the color of ash, Persephone stirred embers in the iron stove while Weston cleaned the last of the cedar shavings from the floor. Birdie was asleep already, her cheek round and flushed with the heat of the day. "I want to marry you," Persephone said. Weston paused, brush halfway to the hearth. "What? I don't want to wait for a preacher. I don't want to wait for spring letters to Oregon that'll never come. I want to be yours now, in every way we can." He set the brush down. "You sure? I've never been more." He crossed the room, took her face in his hands, and kissed her slow. When he pulled back, his voice came out thick with emotion. "Then I'll carve us rings. From that birch near the stream. The one that bent in the storm but didn't break." They were joined in the clearing the next morning, under the bare sky, with only the wind and the birds as witness. Weston wore his Sunday shirt, and Persephone had braided her hair with dried cornflower petals she'd saved in a rag. He took her hands and slipped the carved ring over her finger, and she did the same for him. "I'll stand beside you," he said, "in work, in quiet, in the raising of her, in whatever comes. I'll carry you with me," she answered, "in every meal, every stitch, every storm. You are my safe place." They kissed, and the wind passed through the trees like it was breathing for the earth itself. The seasons turned. The coop filled with hens, and Birdie learned to walk, fists curled and steps wide. She called Weston Da by midsummer. Persephone taught half the children in Fort Benton to read under the shade of the cottonwood near the post office, her skirts dusty and her eyes bright. Weston built a second room onto the cabin, with a window that faced the sunrise. They never sent letters west again. They didn't need to. On quiet evenings, after Birdie had gone to sleep, they sat on the porch with her head against his shoulder and his hand resting over hers. "I didn't know life could feel like this," she once whispered. He kissed the top of her head. "It always could. Just needed the right hands to build it." And they did. Together, fully, without fear. The land changed around them, but their home never did. It held warmth through the winters and shade in the summers, and laughter found its way into every corner. They endured because they had chosen each other, and because they never stopped choosing. When people spoke of them in town, they said Weston Kade had found his match and made a life with her that was steady, sure, and whole, and that Persephone Wren had taken a broken road and made it into something worth walking again. They grew old beneath the same roof. The cradle became a bench, the coop gave way to a barn, and the birch tree by the stream grew tall and silvered. But the rings never left their fingers. Not once.